Can everyone see the screen, or do you need it to be a little darker back here? Are we all good?
Okay, so let's just, are you ready here?
Yeah, I'm
Let me
ready.
just give you a quick intro here.
Sure.
So, everyone, thanks for coming. First, if you look at your watch, we're actually only a little early to be late. For those that aren't familiar with it, Newman time, everything starts on Newman time. Newman time is, I always say 10 minutes, but I was just informed it's really 15 minutes late, so everything runs 15 minutes late. So we're actually 5 minutes early in terms of it. But we're so blessed at the Newman Center to have Josh Merlo here. Josh is just in the final steps of his PhD in philosophy and at UB. Yay, Josh. He's been at this for a long time, and while we've been emotionally supporting him, that's part of it. The real work is what Josh has done. And he has a series that he's been presenting, and this is another step in that series, and we're just we're very glad to have him give a thoughtful discussion. He's gonna talk for 25 or 30 minutes, and then we're gonna do some question answer. And the question answers usually turn out to be pretty good. So think about the questions you want to do, and it's a small enough group that we can hopefully try to get to everybody who has a question. So without further ado, Josh.
You're going to ask me questions, Dennis. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mike, very much for the introduction. Thank you to everyone who's come to these lectures before and decided to come back, and welcome to everyone who's coming to your first Lonergan Lecture. The topic that we're considering tonight is one that you've all probably heard about. I think it's a constant that no matter how old or young of a Catholic or a Christian you are, hell is something that has very much been impressed upon your mind. My parents grew up, and some of you, I'm guessing, also did, with the Baltimore Catechism Church, the pre-Vatican II Church. And there was a different view of hell that was presented, but it was omnipresent. I grew up in a post-Vatican II church, and some of my students who are here tonight did as well. But even for us, we were still very much conditioned to think of those images that are vividly presented in, say, Dante's Inferno. Lakes of fire, sulfurous brimstone, odorously filling the air. Demons torturing souls for eternity. This is very much in opposition to the idea of a loving God that we hear about on Sundays. The parables that Jesus tells his apostles, that he shares with the disciples, they don't communicate to us the idea of a God who would relish punishing his beloved children forever. And yet, the idea of hell persists. So what we're going to talk about tonight is something called universalism. The idea that God saves everyone. And we're going to discuss two things. First, why that tension between hell and a loving God exists in the first place. And second, whether or not universalism, the salvation of all persons, is a tenable solution, a tenable resolution to that tension. So let's begin. If I can figure out how to advance my slides on my fancy new laptop. There we go. The problem of hell. Though we're all familiar with Dante's Inferno, and hopefully some of you have seen the beautiful charcoal renderings that I have in this particular copy. If you'd like to see it, I can show you during the Q&A portion of the talk. We know the images that Dante presents. Fire, demons, pitchforks, wailing people in agony. But what does the church actually teach that hell is? The images of Dante, though famous, and though probably the most well-known presentation of hell, are not doctrinal. That is, an Italian poet, if we could even call him Italian, considering Italy was not united as a country when he was writing, is not a church father. He does not write ex cathedra from the chair of St. Peter. So what does the church herself then actually say that hell is? The church merely describes hell as a place of punishment for unrepentant sinners who die in a state of grave, of serious sin. Other words that are used for hell that mean roughly the same thing. Hell is a state of separation from God. I'm mainly going to focus on the first definition because the second definition has always confused me. How can we be separate from a God who's omnipresent, who's everywhere? So we'll just talk about the first definition. Hell is punishment for bad sinners. Now, there has, of course, been lots and lots of discourse within the tradition of the church, within the history of the church, about what that punishment is. And that's where we get the images that Dante evokes, because he's not the first person to reference them. If you look up hell in Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, you will actually find an article in the question on hell, whether there is actual fire that burns in punishment and purgation the souls of the damned. So the images that Dante evokes, that others speak of, Blake is another example, a little bit more contemporary, although contemporary is a stretch still, we're talking about hundreds of years ago, who uses similar imagery. Though we have these discussions in rhetoric and poetry, in art, they do show up in theological discussions. But they're still largely speculative questions, we would say. Theologians asking, well, is hell like this? The church doesn't really clarify what the punishment in hell looks like. She also, importantly, doesn't really clarify what happens in hell besides that there is some punishment. We don't know, in other words, what hell is like. And as much as Jean-Paul Sartre might want to give us the glib response that hell is other people, we can't really be sure if the punishment in hell is from our fellow denizens, whether it's directly from God or from his angels, as had been suggested in some of the tradition sources, whether it's from the fallen angels. We just don't know. All we know is that hell is punishment. Does hell exist? This is an interesting question that we need to address very early on, because we don't even have to talk about whether there's a tension between hell and a loving God if there's no hell in the first place. Maybe here in the US, we just listen to too many Baptist preachers from the Great Awakenings thundering on about fire and a wrathful, angry God. Maybe that doesn't have to be part of Christianity. Maybe we just got stuck in the Middle Ages with that mindset of an angry God punishing the heretic, punishing the apostate, and we never grew out of that. Maybe we can live in a gentler church, one that doesn't acknowledge the reality of hell. Then we don't have to worry about why a God who loves us would punish us. Unfortunately, this is not an avenue available to us. The church, after defining what hell is, definitively states hell does exist. There is a place for the punishment of those persons who unrepentantly die in a state of serious, of grave sin. In Catholic terminology, we would call this mortal sin. The church does teach that hell is real. And the church does condemn as unorthodox, as heterodox, heretical, those who say that there is no hell, or that hell will eventually go away, or that everyone who is in hell will be removed from hell. We'll come back to those later. But as one of our starting conditions for this discussion, we have to accept that the church says there is a hell. God maintains a place for punishment for those who deserve said punishment. So here's another question. Are there some persons in hell? If hell exists, does anyone go to hell? And this is an interesting question because the church does not authoritatively teach that there is anyone in hell. Think about it this way. What was the grade school definition you learned about saints? They're people that are with God in heaven, right? We know they're good examples for us of living holy lives because they made it to heaven. They're with God. What's the opposite of a saint? You know, the example of what not to be. The person who's not with God forever, who's in hell forever. We don't have people like that. It's not like Judas has a particular title of like anti-saint that tells us he's in hell and he's a horrible person. No, the church doesn't recognize that Judas is this awful person who's definitely in hell. Even Hitler doesn't have this mythical title of anti-saint. The church does not state that anyone's in hell. If you look through the catechism for questions related to this topic, you'll see language like the following. The church does not identify any person in hell because she is not able to on earth render the judgment that only a God who knows the innermost thoughts and wants of a human person can render. And the church can also not rule out an all-loving God's dispensing mercy at the last moment to those who desire it. So though the church does say there are persons in heaven, and you can guess a lot of those identities, I'm sure. We know Mary's in heaven, for example. We know all of the saints are in heaven. She does not do the same with the opposite. The church does not have a list of those who are condemned to hell. There is no authoritative teaching that this person or this person or this person or any person is in hell right now. We'll come back to that as well. Here's the actual problem of hell then. Having established a basic definition for hell, having established that it exists, and having established that the church does not officially teach, authoritatively teach, anything about, call it the population of hell, let's now set up what we in philosophy call our dilemma. Let's set up the actual issue that we need to address. If there were to be some person stuck in hell, punished in hell, would it be right, morally right, for them to be so punished? Would it be just? You might want to say, of course it would be. After all, God is the just judge, and if he decides that someone should go to hell, well, they should go to hell. You don't actually want to say that. That's known as divine command theory. It's basically a might makes right kind of morality. If God can just capriciously, arbitrarily say, well, this is good and this is bad, and I'm making it so today, but I could make it differently tomorrow, well, then you don't really have a system of moral rules, of moral commands for anyone to follow. You don't really have a loving God. You just have a God who does whatever he wants, and you're afraid of him, so you do the thing that he tells you to do today. And if he tells you to do something else tomorrow, well, then you do that. The point here that matters, we can't just say justice is what God decides it is, because then we're robbing justice of the value that we place in it. When we talk about justice, it's supposed to be a standard that applies to everyone. So, yesterday, I think it was yesterday, President Biden pardoned his son. And some of the critiques that came from within his own party, especially from progressive parties, progressive members of the Democratic Party, were that he was circumventing the rule of law. That is, he was using a public power available to the president for a personal purpose, to aid his son. I'm not going to give any political commentary on this, but I would point out the analogy that exists between the critiques of President Biden and what I'm trying to describe here. We want to say that ultimately, you, me, the son of the president, or say, the president himself, were he to be accused of and convicted of multiple felonies, are all subject to the same law. Justice is blind. You've seen the courthouse statues of Lady Justice. What does she wear? A blindfold, because she doesn't care if you are poor or if you're rich. She doesn't care if you are the king or if you are a serf. She doesn't care who you are. Justice, the rule of right, applies to everyone equally. We are all subject to it. So, if we want to believe that there is this rule that governs right action, then even God himself should choose to subject himself to this rule. There's some complicated theological concerns that might be raised, and we can talk about them in the questions and answers if you'd like to. But what's important here, for the moment, justice cannot just be what God decides is justice for a day. It's a rule that applies to everyone. So, is it just then for God to damn some people? Well, why wouldn't it be? God gave us his law. God told us there'd be punishments if we didn't follow the law. And then some people broke the law, and they got the punishments they were informed about beforehand would be administered if they broke the law. This seems to be very much fitting to our sense of justice. But here's the thing. Let's say this is not a recommendation. This is not me telling you to do this, just to be clear, since we are live streaming. Let's say one of you were to rob a bank. You go into the bank, you put on your ski mask. You probably should have put it on before you went in the bank. There's cameras. But let's not get hung up on details. You get the money from the safe. You run outside, and you get captured by the police very quickly because you're a bad bank robber and you didn't put on your ski mask in time, and your runaway car wasn't where it was supposed to be. Anyway, you go to jail. You go before a judge. You're charged with multiple crimes. Possession of a weapon, using a weapon to commit a crime, the crime itself of robbing the bank. You're sentenced after being convicted because you got caught. You are sent to jail. Guess what happens, though? Eventually, you get out of jail if you rob a bank. Well, what if you do something worse? What if, say, you're a serial murderer and you're sentenced to jail for life? There's something key in that sentence for what we're talking about. You're sentenced for life. You eventually die. They can't keep you in jail when you're dead. Or at least it doesn't matter to you anymore. The central problem with hell for the Christian who believes in a just and loving God is its perpetuity. That is, it's that hell never ends. You stay in hell and are punished for the finite crimes you committed in your finite life forever and ever and ever. None of you can commit an infinite number of sins, of crimes against the law of God. There's literally not enough time. But hell isn't proportional to a finite mortal person committing finite sins in a finite life. There's a limit to how much wrong you can do in the world, but there's not a limit to how much punishment you can endure in hell. That's the central worry for the Christian who believes in a loving God. Even if there should be some punishment administered to the sinner, why should the punishment be so severe? And why should the punishment never end? We would rightly say of a justice system that takes people who commit minor crimes and leaves them in jail for the same amount of time as the serial murderers, that there's something wrong with its sentencing. If you're familiar with some of the debates about criminal reform right now, you know that there are objections that have been raised about the length of sentences for minor drug offenses compared to other major crimes. There shouldn't be that comparison. You'll also know that there have been protests about cash bail. There are efforts to attempt to reform laws that require you to pay a certain amount of money to get out of jail. Guess who's able to pay that money? People who have more money. It's not a measurement of how bad your crime was if you get out on bail. It's a measurement of how much money you had in the first place. The point is, though, we see something wrong today, contemporarily, when we look at our flawed human justice system. When people are punished more severely than they should be, given that they committed a minor crime, or when they're punished in the same amount as people who did worse things. But everyone's equal in hell. Once you get in, there's no getting out. You stay there, and you keep suffering. In the Inferno, what does it read above the gates of Dis, the city of hell? Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. That's the problem of hell. You don't get out, there's no hope of reprieve. So how can we resolve this tension? We can't say there's no hell. We can't say you can get out of hell. Maybe we have to say nobody goes there in the first place. Universalism as a theological concept is somewhat ill-defined. It's a word that's used to talk about a bunch of different ideas, unfortunately. Generally, though, we can understand universalism to mean the idea that all persons are saved. That is, that the universal salvation, hence universalism, that God desires for everyone is actualized. God wants us all to be saved, and we are all saved. Everyone goes to heaven, no one goes to hell. That's what universalism is, simply put. And that's all that we need to understand that universalism is to continue our discussion tonight. Now, because we're in the Catholic Church, we have to have another talk about what the Church actually says and what actually counts as not being heretical. So, is universalism an orthodox thesis? In other words, are you a heretic if you believe it? This is where the unclarity about the definition becomes an issue. The Church has condemned some versions of universalism. Which versions? Well, if you say everyone is saved because hell doesn't exist, that's heretical because the Church said that hell exists. If, like, say, Origen, one of the Church Fathers, you say that universalism is true because even the persons who go to hell eventually are released, it's just a longer version of purgatory, that was also condemned as heretical. Now, again, there's complicated historical context about why what Origen taught was condemned as heretical. It might have actually just been done because he had political rivals who wanted him to be less influential, but that's something that we have to ask the historians about. The point is, that would be another version of a heterodox, a non-orthodox universalism. You can't say someone goes to hell and eventually gets out of hell. That's just not how the Church believes that hell works. However, this does not mean that every version of universalism is heterodox, is non-doctrinal. While there are particular theses the Church has condemned, that does not mean the Church condemns all versions of the thesis. There's something very important to understand when we're talking about church doctrine. Our namesake, Cardinal John Henry Newman, put it this way: church doctrine evolves through heresy. What did Newman mean by this? Theology is hard. We don't understand God. And so the church is very, very careful about what she says about the God that we don't understand. Popes just don't go out every day, speak to St. Peter's Square and be like, hey guys, I just had an idea about God that I'm going to tell everyone is definitely true. No. There are still things Jesus said. Catholics believe Jesus to be the incarnate Son of God that we don't understand. And so the church, recognizing that some parts of God are truly mysterious, there are some things about our faith we will never fully understand by intellect alone, is very cautious about defining elements of the faith. That is, of saying, it is certainly true that this is the case. So, when Newman said that the church evolves, or her teachings evolve through heresy, he meant this. The church usually only defines things when there's a bad teaching. And then the church only defines things negatively. She will say, don't say that. Well, can I say this? I didn't say you couldn't. I just know you can't say that thing. So we know you can't say universalism is true because hell doesn't exist. That's bad. We know you can't say universalism is true because everybody gets out of hell eventually. That's bad. But guess what? There's a lot of conceptual space left open to us. If there's only a few heresies or a few heretical versions of universalism, the church has condemned. I'd like to present one of those. The thesis that hell is empty is one that has been entertained within the Christian tradition. Within the Catholic tradition, it is probably entertained most famously by Hans Urs von Balthasar, a German philosopher and theologian, in his book, Dare We to Hope. As you hopefully noticed, I stole his title for my talk. Von Balthasar theorizes that we can resolve the tension between a loving God and the perpetual suffering of those who are damned by saying, no one is ever damned. No one is sent to hell. If the church says hell is real, okay, you maintain hell exists. You just say hell is not populated. Though there is a place to punish unrepentant, grave sinners, there never is someone who meets the criteria of being unrepentant in a state of mortal sin when they die. Remember, what is a mortal sin? The church tells us it has to be a grave or a serious matter. You have to do it fully freely, that is, without being coerced, without being tricked, and you have to do it with full knowledge. You have to understand what you're doing is bad and is also very bad. Only if all three of those conditions are met have you sinned mortally. Again, perhaps a topic for the questions and answers, can we sin mortally? How many of our actions are fully free? Do we have a full understanding of the consequences of the gravity of the morality of? If there are no mortal sinners, there is no one who could go to hell. Or alternatively, the other condition, if there are no unrepentant mortal sinners, then no one can go to hell. Can we really say, to take the language of the Old Testament, that there are persons whose hearts are hardened like stones, so much so that at the moment of their death, they don't at least acknowledge I could have done better and I wish that I had? That they don't hope for mercy in the next life? If that's the case, then as the church says, and this is a paraphrase directly from the Catechism, we trust to the love of a merciful God to respond to those last prayers, those last pleas for mercy. So that's the kind of universalism I'm advocating for tonight. We might dare to hope that hell is empty. This is doctrinally allowable. The church hasn't said this is true, but the church also hasn't said it's not true. And so in that sort of figuratively gray conceptual space is where we can speculatively, theoretically muse, is this a way to avoid the problem of hell? Now, I mentioned Hans Urs von Balthasar, and there's another reason for that besides him being probably the most famous proponent in the Catholic tradition of the hell is empty form of universalism. And it's this. We might object that even though the church does not formally condemn this form of universalism, it is at odds with the church's tradition. You've heard these readings at Mass. The fiery Gehenna, the darkness where there'll be wailing and gnashing of teeth. It would be better for that person if he were never born. And then we can look to the Pauline epistles. We can look to other epistles in the New Testament that speak of a coming punishment, that speak of a day of judgment. The book of Revelation is entirely a description of what judgment will look like, even though it's written in the apocalyptic style, and so it's probably something more akin to a parable or a proverb for those suffering persecution in the Roman Empire. The point is, though, we have biblical evidence of a hell, and it at least seems in the Bible that hell is not empty. That is, we have Jesus, we have other spokespersons, if you will, prophets for the divine, talking of those who will go to hell. And then they will be separated, the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And those on his right will go into endless rejoicing, whereas those on his left will go into endless punishment. That sounds like the final judgment, and a final judgment where not everyone goes to heaven. There are further examples I could give, but I think we're all familiar enough with the biblical accounts of hell to recognize it seems like in the Bible, hell is spoken of as being populated. And that's not even addressing the Christian tradition at large. Many of those within the tradition speak of hell being populated, speak of there being bad enough sinners for there to be persons in hell. There are saints who claim to have had mystical visions of hell, claim to have seen hell, to have heard the agonized cries of those in hell. So how do we address that? The dichotomy, if you will, between the Christian tradition's description of those in hell and our speculative position of hell being empty. Von Balthasar actually dedicates much of his work to this very question. And he points out a few things that I will repeat here. The biblical tradition is not at all unified with respect to hell's being populated. That is to say, for every Bible passage that you can point to that suggests there is a hell, there's another passage that talks about the absolute love of God, the mercy and forgiving nature that God possesses. Think of the parables of Jesus. Sure, we have the parable of what are they? I think there's 10 each, of the wise and the foolish virgins, and people get left out of the wedding feast. But then we also have the parable of the prodigal son, of a father welcoming back a son who spends his inheritance on whores. And yes, we have the separation of the sheep and the goats. And then we have the widow searching for her lost coin, the shepherd searching for the one lost sheep of the 99, and the widow who has only a penny. She has a feast with her neighbors when she finds it because she rejoices. The shepherd abandons his entire flock to search out the one who is missing, and again celebrates when he finds it. The Bible does not speak with one voice about hell being full of those deserving damned. The Bible also speaks of a God who is willing to forgive almost anything. Does Jesus ever speak of an unforgivable sin? Well, yes, but not in all the Gospels. And if you read biblical commentaries on what this sin is, no one seems to actually know what it is. But most commentators are pretty sure that blaspheming the Holy Spirit is not something an everyday person would ever do. In other words, the only time Jesus says something is unforgivable, it's probably not applicable to any of you. It's probably not a sin any of you could even understand, let alone commit. And remember, for it to be a mortal sin, you have to know not just that it's a sin, but it's a really bad sin. And that's the only thing that Jesus says is unforgivable. Outside of the biblical tradition, what might we say about the theological tradition? What might we say about the visions of the saints? Well, as von Balthasar points out, the major names in the Christian tradition we often speak of, especially Augustine, Thomas Aquinas as well, these are persons who are associated with particular veins, let's call them, of Christian thought. Where did the doctrine of original sin come from? Augustine. He's not someone who's focusing on the forgiveness and mercy of God. He's very much focusing on the fact that we are fallen and trying to make sense of how a fallen race might be redeemed. Thomas, as I said, writes in the Summa a question that is resolved at one point into a focused question on whether or not the flames of hell are actual. That's also not focusing on the love and mercy of God. There are other members of the Christian tradition, though, who take a much more expansive view on different attributes of God. Less so his justice, more so, as I mentioned, that forgiveness, that love, that mercy. And in the overall Christian tradition, we have to remember that God's attributes are never to be in conflict. We have to understand them as being unified, as being in some sense one. So it's not like there could be the wrathful God of the Old Testament over here, and then the next day he decides to be merciful. We have to somehow understand how his desire for justice and his desire to forgive all of us might work together, might be identical in some sense. And as for the visions of the saints, well, von Balthasar merely notes that other saints have had visions of an empty hell or of a fully populated heaven. Maybe it's a problem of advertising. It's a lot less dramatic when you're talking about, yep, there's a lot of happy people with God, than when you're talking about fire, pitchforks, demons, and you're all going there unless you listen to me and become better persons. The point of all of this is to say, there isn't a monolithic tradition on hell. It's not like we have the loving good shepherd occasionally, but then everything else from the church and from the Bible is the angry God, the God whose hands we as sinners are in. That's not what the tradition is like at all. And maybe we lack familiarity with these other parts of the tradition, or maybe they have been emphasized for various historical reasons by those in the church with louder voices, or at least with authoritative positions, but that doesn't mean that those parts of the tradition have ceased to exist, or, importantly, that those parts of the tradition have been rejected by the church. Von Balthasar's universalism, and I say this categorically, has not been officially rejected. The church does not take a position on its truth. If we want to talk about the visions of individual saints, personal revelation is not held to be doctrinal, binding by the church. That is to say, the church doesn't state categorically, yes, this saint definitely saw hell. Yes, this saint definitely saw heaven. And when you have persons here on earth talking about what comes in the next life, even if they're Augustine or Thomas or John Duns Scotus or any other of the luminaries within the tradition, well, they can be wrong. The most famous example of this, Thomas Aquinas thought it was very, very unlikely that the Immaculate Conception was a real thing. Just because you're a named saint and a doctor of the church doesn't mean you're always right. So, sure, Augustine might focus more on us being sinners in the hands of an angry God, on the fall, on the need for redemption. That doesn't make his way of viewing the overall tradition on heaven and hell authoritative. And that's what we're interested in here. So, to end my part of this discussion, does von Balthasar's version of universalism solve our problem? Yes, because our problem exists precisely because hell exists. If there is no one being punished for all time, if there was no one suffering infinitely, then there is no contradiction, apparent or otherwise, between an all-loving, all-merciful, all-forgiving God and disproportionate punishment for crimes that could have been prevented if God had made the world differently, if he had given us enough grace, if he had put the right person in our lives. That's not an issue if no one ever ends up in hell. So yes, it does resolve the problem. To end, I wanted to quote something that von Balthasar cites in his Dare We Hope That All Might Be Saved. From the first letter to Timothy, God desires, and von Balthasar adds this emphasis, all men to be saved. And so, in the tradition of von Balthasar, we stand in hope that hell is empty because God loves us, is merciful, and in his mercy forgives the sins we deserve punishment for. Thank you. If you have questions, go ahead and raise your hand. Vicky's going to go around with a microphone. Please make sure you speak into the microphone so the people who are streaming and the people at the other ends of the room can hear you.
I'm sorry, Josh, but I just gotta. Okay, so first of all, what a really great job. And I truly, truly hope that everything you said is true. All right, that's what I first want to say. But my understanding is that God gave us a free will. So God isn't going to have anyone go to heaven if they don't want to be there. That's my first thought. Secondly, they do say that, the devil's biggest power is to make us believe that he is non-existent or non-powerful. And it seems like if Jesus died on a cross, that's a pretty serious thing for a non-threatening hell. The other issue I have with this is that John Bosco, St. Faustina, the three children at Fatima, and even Mary saw hell and were terrified. And I have a hard time thinking that they were lying. So I'm super curious about which saints that saw an empty hell or a full heaven.
So for the third question, I would have to look up the particular saints that von Balthasar mentions, which I can do for you. The other two questions I can give you a much more satisfactory answer to, though. Well, I shouldn't say that. I can give you an answer to the other questions that is fuller. So first, on free will, no, God is not going to make anyone go to heaven. That is accurate. The question that we need to ask is whether anyone actually wants to go to hell, I think. And this is tied into that idea of whether or not there are any unrepentant grave sinners. So whether or not anyone dies in a state of mortal sin that they do not feel contrition, right sorrow for. Now, none of us have, I think, fully an understanding of what hell is. And I'm guessing none of us in this room have had a mystical vision of hell. So that doesn't really give us a way to say, oh, we're fully choosing to be with God or to not be with God. Normally when the church discusses this idea that we choose to be with God in heaven or to be separated from God in hell, she instead means that we live our lives in a way that either merits reward or merits punishment. Sidestepping the issue of whether we can merit the reward of heaven, we can't. The question of what we do and whether it merits punishment is the one that we have to discuss. So, can we freely act in a way that demands or that deserves for us to be punished perpetually? As I said, there's a mismatch here between finite actions. You and I have a limit on our life. We will both eventually die. That means there's a limit to the number of bad things that I can do. I can work really, really hard at it for my entire life. Eventually, there will be a cutoff to the number of bad things I can do. There is not a cutoff to my suffering in hell. So there's a mismatch between finite wrongdoing, which would deserve punishment, sure, but a finite punishment. And because of that, it's difficult to say that we could choose, so to speak, by acting wrongly to be separated from God, just because the separation is of a different kind than us separating ourselves here on earth. Even the worst sinner still has only created a finite distance in a figurative sense, between herself and God. Again, because of the nature of what we can do. But hell is still going to be the unbridgeable chasm that we hear about in the Gospels between heaven, the bosom of Abraham, and those punished in hell. The more important piece, though, of any response to the question of free will, how free are we really? So, the second condition for a sin to be a mortal sin, it has to be done fully freely. Normally, when the church talks about this, it's in very crude terms. Not crude in like an impolite way, but crude in terms of the examples being very simplistic. So, I'm guessing for those of you who have ever studied, what counts as a mortal sin, you get this kind of example. If someone puts a gun to your head and tells you to do a bad thing, then that's not a mortal sin because you were forced to do it. Now, that's accurate. Yes, if you are physically or coerced through the threat of physical violence to do something bad, it is not a mortal sin. It is not a serious sin because you did not choose to do that fully freely. But there are less obvious examples that are far more important, because most of us are not threatened by armed persons to do bad things. But the cases that matter are those everyday cases and how free we are to do those bad things that we do during those everyday scenarios when we are presented with temptation. Do I do this particular action or not? Well, if we want to talk about how free I am to do it, it's not just a question of the threat of physical violence. It's a question of, call it formation that I may have had, positive or negative. So, positive formation, was I exposed to the right persons to give me a strong enough sense of moral rightness and moral wrongness? Was I given the role models that I needed in life to be able to follow an example of not yielding to temptation? Was I conditioned to act in this particular way because I grew up in a society where that was seen as being a way to protect myself or protect those close to me? Because I grew up in a resource-scarce area. There's a lot of these different conditionals that can be raised that, when we get into more academic discussions of free will, are spoken of as defeaters of free will. That is, as things that limit our ability to be fully free. So, because I don't want to ramble on too much about free will, I'll summarize it in this way. If we want to ask about freely choosing to be with God or to not be with God, which I think is a very legitimate question to ask, we then have to be very careful in how we define what it means to freely choose or not to freely choose. Because if we're adopting this very expansive view of what you need to be free, then very, very rapidly you get that most of our choices are not, in fact, completely free. To the second, I think I have the numbering right. The second of your comments, is hell serious if nobody's in it? Absolutely. Why is hell serious? Because the crucifixion is anything but unserious. The reason for the crucifixion, if you're adopting a particular theological view, he's not here tonight, but I know Father Roy doesn't like it when I say this, so sorry, Father, if you're watching. If you're adopting a particular theological view that Jesus' incarnation and then his death was done to atone for, that is to make up for our sins, then that's why we can argue hell is empty. It's not that just nobody goes to hell ever, it's an empty threat. It's rather, nope, you are going to hell except for the sacrifice, the redeeming sacrifice of the literal Son of God. Other questions?
Okay, so where does evil and Satan that you hear, in fact, there was just something in our bulletin about how Satan roams around and is tempting us to do bad things. Where does Satan come into this?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I don't want to give the impression that I'm trying to diminish the presence of evil in the world. I actually think questions like the problem of hell, which is a version of what philosophers of religion call the problem of evil, very much require that eponymous thing, evil itself. So, how do we address this? Well, let's start with evil. Saying that hell is empty does not deny that there exists evil in the world, that people do evil things in the world. Rather, it denies that people do bad enough things unrepentantly so as to be damned to hell. That is to say, remember we talked about conditions for damnation, unrepentant state of mortal sin at time of death. What I'm denying, or at least what I'm, to put it a little less forcefully, a little more carefully, what I'm suggesting is that it is possible that there are no persons who meet those twin conditions. Rather, it might be that all persons are either repentant enough, contrite enough that God grants them mercy, or it might be that because it's so difficult really to meet all three conditions for a mortal sin, you never have persons in a state of mortal sin when they die. That doesn't mean, though, that we're denying there is sin at all. There most definitely is. That also doesn't mean that we're denying that there is grave sin. The questions that I would raise have much more to do with our understanding of something's being a sin and its seriousness, and then also the freedom by which, or within which, I don't actually know what word to use there, we act, we do the wrong thing. But I think it's, quite frankly, silly. It goes against our experience of the world to say that there is no evil in the world. So I appreciate the question, because I do not want at all to make it seem like I'm denying there's evil in the world. Rather, what I'm saying is that evil is not greater than the love of God. And again, as I said to Mary, the love of God shown, manifested in the giving of his Son. If you've ever listened fully to the Exultant during the Easter Vigil Mass, the sin of Adam is called the happy sin of Adam, the felix culpa in Latin. Why is it good that Adam and Eve sinned? It's not good that they sinned, but what does it say in the Exultant? The happy sin of Adam that earned for us so great a Redeemer. It's what happens after the sin that is so much greater than the badness of the sin itself. And so, yes, there's evil in the world that we need saving from. So, it's not that there isn't evil, it's that the salvation offered is so much greater than the evil that it can result in a world in which no one has to be damned. No one has to suffer perpetually forever. So the question for those of you live streaming, what about Satan, demons, fallen angels? So the term Satan itself is curious because Christians have adopted it to mean the character of the devil, whereas in the Bible, the word Satan, the original word that we've translated, was not necessarily a reference to the prince of demons. Rather, a Satan, because it was used as like a title, was a challenger. You know the English phrase for this, the devil's advocate. So in the book of Job, for example, when Satan comes to God, that's not necessarily the devil saying, let's have a bet, God, that I can torture one of the people who loves you. It's a challenger. It's someone saying, you think this person loves you, let's test that. So we have to be careful then about reading biblical passages that we have in English rendering Satan as the devil in that way when that wasn't necessarily the original intention of the biblical authors. This being said, does the church believe that there are fallen angels? Yes. Now again, what does the church actually say about fallen angels? It's another area that we have to be cautious when making bold assertions about. The church doesn't say a lot about angels themselves. And even some of the biblical sources that we would reference for our knowledge of the angels, so say the book of Revelation, you have the dragon that seeks to eat the child born of the virgin, or you see one who falls from heaven, the star that falls from heaven. This is a very, very nuanced text. As I said, written in a particular style that was designed to, in some ways, code for Christians during a time of persecution a message of hope. So was the dragon the devil in a literal sense, or was the author talking about a particular Roman emperor who he didn't want to name? Because then if the emperor saw that, he would get mad and kill even more Christians. So this is not to say there is not a devil, there is not fallen demons. It's to say that a lot of the traditions that we've built around them, they're somewhat similar to what we see in Dante's Inferno. It's not coming directly from the church. It's not the church saying, this is definitely what we know about angels, about demons, this is what we're stating doctrinally about them. A lot of what we say about them, it comes from this more speculative tradition. So, yes, there's biblical evidence for fallen angels and leaders among fallen angels. The Prince of Darkness, Jesus refers to the devil in this way. How much can we conclude from that? I don't know. A lot of it, again, is going to depend either on personal revelation or it's going to depend on this extrapolatory work that is not based on a direct, definitive declaration by the church. So, yes, the church says there are fallen angels, there are demons. Yes, the church says they are involved somewhat in the evil in the world. Does that mean we should be like the preachers who are casting out the demon of depression or the demon of obsessive compulsive disorder? No, you should go see a therapist. So the question, why do we have exorcists? Because the church believes that there are fallen angels, that there are demons, and believes that they can, in some cases, possess individuals. So to say that the church doesn't have a definitive demonology in the sense that you had in, say, some of the medieval textbooks about it. So medieval textbooks that you had about demons or about witches or about other kinds of supernatural entities. To say that the church hasn't published a book like that in a long time is not to say that the church does not believe that there are demons that can exercise supernatural abilities in this world, which is why you have priests trained in exorcisms. However, It should also be noted that, at least contemporarily, the church will also have a psychologist or a psychiatrist consult in cases where she investigates the need for an exorcist. That is, the church wants to rule out natural causes of an apparent possession before engaging in an exorcism. The church doesn't want to mistake something that could be mental illness for an actual demonic possession. She is careful to invoke the power of God for the very real and serious evil of a demonic possession in cases where it might not actually be that. So, again, this is not to say there are no demons or there are no demonic possessions. It's to say that the church is very careful about what she says counts as demonic influence, as a demonic possession. And it's to say that the church is very careful when she has priests engage in the rites of exorcism. Yes, I'm not denying the reality of evil, of fallen angels, of demons, of the devil. And the church certainly doesn't do this either. She teaches they exist. The clarificatory remark that I'm giving is merely that the church does not say, every single time this happens, that means you're possessed. Or all 15 of these historical events were demonic possessions. You're not getting the kind of definitive statements you get about something like, say, Mary's assumption into heaven, about something like, say, the Trinity, about something like, say, the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. That is a different kind of teaching. That's a general, a universal, a declared teaching. Issues like demonic possession are handled at an individual case-by-case level. That's all that the remark is.
Hi. My question is, if we believe, or say someone believes in universalism and thinks that everyone will be saved, what is the point in encouraging people to do good or to live their lives a certain way? Is it to make less suffering while they're here on earth? Is it to reduce time in purgatory? Like, why would you ever, because I have a child,
Yep.
right? If I think she's going to heaven no matter what she's going to do, what's the point in encouraging any kind of particular behavior?
So it's a very good question. I'm first going to propose a very similar scenario to what you just described, and then I'm going to answer the question. So, among a lot of neuroscience researchers and philosophers of mind who do similar work, there is a belief that free will is not real. It is illusory. We think we can make choices. Our choices are actually predetermined before we make them. So, a question's come up. If that's true, do we tell people? Because if you think, well, I was always gonna, go do this bad thing, go rob the bank, I can't change that, I'm just a horrible person, it's set in my genetic code or something. Genetic determinism is false, by the way, but regardless, should we tell people, or should we keep the convenient lie, so to speak, of free will? It's an ongoing debate where free will researchers don't actually know what to do if it's not a real thing, except rely on our intuition that it is a real thing. That is, free will still is motivating even to people who don't think it's a real thing, which is very interesting and counterintuitive, but there are researchers who don't think we have free will who still act as if we have it, because they can't shake the feeling that I choose my actions. They're not chosen for me. So, to the question of hell. If hell is empty, if universalism is true, how do we encourage people to do good? Well, one, I think the mere presence of hell in Catholic theology and Christian theology is still going to have a motivating force. But two, and more importantly, I don't think that's the right way to frame the question of doing good or the need for doing good. If I only do good things because I'm afraid God is going to burn me for a very long time, I'm not doing good things. So, Immanuel Kant, Prussian philosopher, one of the greatest ethicists probably in the history of the human race. Kant talks about how to do a truly morally good action requires that I do it from what he refers to as autonomy. That is, I do it only because I recognize it is a good thing to do, not for any other reason. I don't do it because I think the cute girl at my high school is going to look at me and be like, wow, you're amazing for doing that good thing. I don't do it because I hope that the kid I'm pulling out of the lake has a rich uncle who's going to give me a reward. I don't do it so that I get on the front page of the newspaper. I don't do it for any selfish reason. So I don't do the good thing to not go to hell. I do the good thing because I recognize I owe you, I owe my fellow persons a particular responsibility, because I recognize they deserve to be treated in this way and not this other way, because I recognize the value of life around me, and because I want to give that life goodness. I think that's the right way to frame it, where it's not so much that we're teaching our children, be afraid of hell, and that's why you should be a good person. We're teaching them, do good for other persons, because that's a good thing to do. Good itself should be the reward, should be the cause. It shouldn't be something that I gain or something that I avoid having. Do good because it's a good thing to do. So Kant has a very fun, so the comment was that we also have a feeling of good when we do good, which seems to be rewarding to us. Kant has a very fun response to this. He says if you ever feel good when you do something good, it's no longer a good thing. So he actually describes in one of his books how there's this miserly philanthropist. There's a rich guy who hates giving away his money, and he's the only person who can be a good, person when it comes to doing charity because he hates being charitable. I think that's a little extreme. The point is well taken, though, that yes, doing good does in fact reward us somehow. We don't have to always look for a negative motivator to explain why it is we ought to do something. And I also think that having that positive thing is a first step for Anna's daughter or for my son. It's very hard to, talk to kids about the categorical imperative as much as I expect my 2-year-old to understand it. They're not going to get an abstract moral principle. We can start with, well, how did you feel when you did the good thing? And then we can work our way up to, well, we do the good thing because we recognize the goodness of other persons and we recognize that we have moral duties to care for them because they're good. It's a starting point, I think.
A little bit different. I was questioning the idea of the disproportion of punishment, of hell as punishment for a mortal act, because it seems to my mind that it's not necessarily how long you're going to live to do multiple acts that are bad, but the consequences of any single act can have eternal consequences. You kill somebody, that person is not going to be able to come back. They're dead forever. Hell is forever.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to phrase the question of proportionality. There's an easy response to give. That even if you hadn't killed that person, they would have eventually died. And even if they had lived a longer life, and let's say they had more children, or they were able to touch the lives of someone else, even if you start accounting for all of these, we'll call them downstream effects, there's still cutoff points for them. And that no matter how much we could extend out the good that you remove from the world by ending a life, or even by doing something less serious, even if we can account for all of this good that you took out of the world, there still would have been an end point to it. Because even this world that we live in, the universe that we inhabit, itself is limited within time and within space. So the problem that I'm raising is this. The proportionality ends up just being a question about finitude and infinitude. I don't think we can ever regard anything that exists in a physical universe as being infinite because there are no really existing infinite quantities. Now, that's a matter for debate. However, what I think I can say to make this a little bit less abstract, a little bit less reliant on number theory, is this. With hell, there's the quantitative issue, so to speak, perpetual suffering, it never ends. But then we also have to take into account the qualitative issue. Is the badness that I inflict on you, that I inflict on the persons connected to you, that I inflict on the people in the future who might have been affected by you, in this life, comparable to the quality of suffering that I experience in hell? If heaven is eternal bliss, is unending bliss, Thomas Aquinas describes it as the joy of beatitude, being with God, then the opposite of being with God has to be really, really, really bad. And so the question would be, is there a comparative to the utter abandonment of being separated from God forever to what I can do on this earth in both the timeline of my life, but then also the extended timeline of the person who I affected, the person they would have affected, and so on and so forth. Is that comparable to not just unending suffering in hell, but the badness, the severity of the suffering experienced in hell? So there is also that qualitative question that I didn't raise in the initial talk, but that has to be accounted for when we're trying to make this comparison between here's what you did on earth, here are the effects of it, the long-term, the future effects of it, and here's what you will experience in hell in the afterlife, the effects of it, the lastingness of it.
The other thing is, is when you talk about the non-repentant, or, the individual who, upon dying, they become repentant. If they're only repenting because they're afraid of hell, where does that factor in? They're not repentant for any moral reason. It's simply just to save themselves.
I agree entirely, but how many people in this room have went to confession because we're only afraid of hell? So yes, the church does teach that true contrition is needed for confession, for not for the, how do I want to say this, because I have to be very careful with my words because I see Mike watching me in the back. The sacrament is never ineffective. That is to say, God doesn't make bad sacraments. However, there are things we have to do for the stuff the sacrament gives us to help us. And one of the things we have to do with confession is to be truly repentant, which is not, ooh, I'm scared of hell, so I'm going to say I'm sorry, even though I'm not really sorry. I'd do the thing again if there wasn't a hell. True contrition, true repentance is, I realize I did something bad, I realize it harmed persons, and I'm sorry about that. Now, caveat, the church does say that the fear of hell is a starting point for true contrition. So it's sort of like what I was talking to Anno about earlier. You're not going to get the kid to the Kantian level of do good only because it's good as like the first moral principle they have. You might have to start off with, I'll give you a candy bar if you like help dad bring in the groceries. But the goal is to get you there eventually. And so within Catholic theology, we would say that's where purgatory has a place. You had an inkling you did wrong and that you should be sorry for it. But you're not ready for heaven yet if you were only sorry because you were afraid of hell. And so then purgatory would be readying you, perfecting you, so that you could eventually realize, here's why it was wrong, and here's why I should be fully sorry, and now I am fully sorry. And that's when you would leave purgatory and enter into heaven.
So everything's relative. All these qualifications for all of these constructs, I mean, evil exists. Taking a life that will never be returned, and the survivors or the loved ones will live with that sadness and sorrow for all of their lives. The fact that I do it again, if it weren't, but I'll say I'm sorry because I don't want to go to hell, but yet I'm intrinsically bankrupt morally. All of that is not going to be enough to equal the measure of God's love in allowing us to spend eternity with Him.
You are describing a person that I don't think could go to heaven. The version of universalism that I am proposing requires us to think that there are no such persons, that everyone has some sense of right and wrong, has some sense of guilt for wrong actions, and has some sense of needing to make up for those wrong actions. So it's an anthropological disagreement, I would say. Hence hope. Yes, hence hope, exactly. We'll take one or two last questions.
On the topic of free choice, good and evil, I'm concerned about the concept of conscience and the prevailing understanding in psychology regarding sociopathy that tells us that there are criteria that define a person without a conscience, a person unable to differentiate between good and evil, and will consequently create problems for himself, herself, others.
So the clinically defined psychopath is a very interesting outlier case. Again, there's an easy response to this, and then there's an interesting response to this. So the easy response would be that the psychopath cannot mortally sin because he is not fully free in his actions. That is to say that the mental condition is actually affecting his ability to freely choose. So that's the easy answer. And that is something that the church will reference with respect to mortal sin, specifically when the church discusses the question of whether or not suicide is a mortal sin. She will state, and this is again a direct reference to the Catechism, that in order for a person to become suicidal, to want to take her life, that requires some kind of psychological affect that makes it so that the person is no longer freely in control of her actions. And so because of that, the church is not going to say, yes, that person automatically goes to hell. Rather, that person would obviously not be mortally sinning because she would not meet the definition for a mortal sin. So we could categorize psychopaths in that way. Because of this mental affect, they are just not able to meet all of the criteria for a mortal sin. Here's a more interesting response, though. When we talk about morality, how important are our emotions to morality? Because psychopathy is usually best defined, or has as one of the primary criteria for its definition, the inability to be empathetic to the emotions of others, and then also the inability to feel guilt. It's related to that first criteria, the inability to feel guilt for wrongdoing. Does that make me unable to recognize making people hurt is bad? So in philosophy, when we talk about philosophy of mind, we talk about cognitive versus conative affects. Cognitive is my mind, my intellect. Conative my heart, or my emotions. So psychopaths would be lacking in the conative aspects of morality, the things that cue most of us into doing bad stuff. I punch someone in the face and I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. And you feel that in the pit of your stomach. Psychopath doesn't have that. But is morality merely conative, or is there a cognitive aspect? Because if there's something that's reason-based, if I, like my good friend Immanuel Kant said I could, am able to build from principles of reason, this is right and this is wrong, based on my understanding of the world and my relationships to the entities in it, then I can still have a purely reasonable understanding of morality. I just lack that feeling sense that most persons have. So I'd be operating with a very, very, call it dry, if you will, moral sense, where I don't have the helpful emotions that most of us have that prod us to say, don't do this, you're going to hurt that person, you know you don't like it when you get hurt. The psychopath wouldn't have that. But that doesn't mean that he would be unable to do sort of the ethical calculus of pain is bad for this reason, neurons firing causes this experience in the body, pain shouldn't be caused because that experience is bad, and bad experiences in general should not be created if it's not necessary to do so, so I shouldn't do this. I am not a psychologist or a neuroscientist, so I'm going to end my answer there because we're stretching the limits of what I understand about psychopathy, but I think it's worth bringing up this question of how much the things that the psychopath lacks, namely emotions and the ability to understand the emotions of others, the internal experience of others, how much that would prevent the psychopath from being moral in some sense. I don't think it is impossible for them to behave morally, which then would open, I think, at least a possible avenue to there being reward and punishment for actions, even if it was diminished because their mental condition, the psychopathy, affected their ability to fully engage in the moral life of a normal human person. A last question?
I just was wondering, did you say that von Balthasar said that hell is empty or that it's not populated? I'm just trying to remember some.
So von Balthasar says that we can hope that hell is not empty. He does not say it is not populated. He says that it is possible it is not populated.
Mm-hmm. The reason why I ask is just because this came to my mind when I saw, the snow falling earlier today. And I know that apparitions, saints, you said you were going to look stuff up, but I just remember Mary saying at Fatima that people are falling like snowflakes into hell. So it's like, do we take her literally? I'd like to believe, that, what she's saying is true. So that's why confusion comes into play when...
Sure. So again, the church does not hold that any personal revelation, so that would be any apparition, is dogmatic or is binding. That is to say, as a Catholic, there are things you must believe in to be a Catholic. You can't be a Catholic and think that the Eucharist is a symbol. You can't be a Catholic and think that God is three different gods, that the Trinity is three different gods. You can't be a Catholic and think that Jesus wasn't actually the Son of God. So those are things that we're going to call doctrinal or dogmatic.
Right.
Personal revelation is distinct from that. That is to say, I can be a Catholic and not believe that Mary appeared at Lourdes, at Fatima, to
Right.
Juan
That's
Diego.
true.
And so given that, there's an epistemic difference, let's say, a difference in how these items should affect our beliefs. As a Catholic, you don't really have a choice about believing the dogma. You do have a choice, so to speak, about believing personal revelation. That is not to say that the apparitions were false. That is to say,
Especially that one.
it is to say, however, that we do not have the church's assurance that they were true in the same way we have the church's assurance that, for example, hell does exist, Or, for example, that heaven does exist and these saints are in heaven. The case that von Balthasar builds, and the case that I am echoing, is not one of definitiveness, is not one of certitude. It is rather simply saying there is a possibility that no one is in hell. And that is presented as contrasting to, we know there are persons in heaven. Because we don't have the same dogmatic definition of there are these persons in hell, there exists a possibility that there is no one in hell. And that possibility presents itself as the best solution to the tension between God's being loving, merciful, and forgiving, and God subjecting people to the perpetual torment of hell. So the case, to be precise about this, for both von Balthasar and myself, is not to assert hell is empty. It's, to use his language, to present the hope in the possibility that hell could be empty.
So it's up to us to believe what we want to believe, basically. You presented very well.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Josh, thank you very much for doing this. I mean, you're fantastic. And I realized you did this without any notes. It's amazing what you're able to do. Very impressive, very impressive. Thank you. Josh is gracious. We've been talking on and off about this being a series that he's doing, and we're going to have another chapter in this series coming up. And Josh and I have to talk about the timeline for it, but hopefully you'll spread this to your friends because I think this is a useful discussion. So thanks once again, Josh. Awesome job. Thank you.